I love world building. I love world building as a craft because it's weirdly universal. Every creator does it. Regardless of medium or genre, if you've ever created a narrative or a setting, you've done this. Writers, game devs, dungeon masters all do it. Even people who've never finished a story in their life and just have a map sitting somewhere in a notebook. Whatever the case may be, stories have to exist somewhere, and I love it. There's something addictive about opening up a blank page and thinking, okay, if this were real, how would it actually work? There's this feeling of ownership that I love. I'm building a world that I want to build with my rules. That's world building. But here's what I've noticed over the years. Not all world building is the same. There are people who build worlds that look massive, they look epic, they look like an ocean of ideas. And then you step into them and realize they're barely ankle deep. But this is what makes world building difficult. There are levels to world building. I think the best way to explain this is something every world builder has done. When you drew your first map, you probably did this. You draw your continent, maybe you sprinkled some beans on the paper to help you. You throw down some mountains, you put cities near the coast, and then you start drawing rivers where they look cool. They cut across entire land masses, they split in the middle of nowhere, they run from coast to coast. You've got rivers branching like tree roots, reconnecting and crossing mountain ranges for no reason. And at the time, you're thinking, yeah, this looks good. Then you watch one map-making video, just one, and you suddenly realize you had no idea how rivers work. You find out they don't split like that. They don't casually cross mountain ranges. They flow downhill, they converge, they follow elevation. You look back at your old map and you realize how much you didn't know. That's what world building can be like. You can think your world is deep just because you loaded it with detail. But depth isn't everything. And that's the difference that I wanted to talk about. There's levels to world building. And if you're building your own world right now, this might show you exactly where you are. So if you're not familiar with this type of video, or what I mean by 7 levels of world building, here's what we're doing. We're going to walk through the 7 levels of what I think make a strong world builder. At each level, I'll break down what defines it, what it usually looks like, and I'll give examples to better help you understand. And, just to be clear, this isn't rigid. Most people have pieces of multiple levels. You might hear me explain level 5 and think that sounds like you, but you haven't covered number 4 yet. That's normal. These aren't steps you climb in order, they're more like tiers of understanding. This is an ascending order of importance and depth, but that doesn't mean you're locked into one. It's just a way to classify how you're thinking about your world. And before we get into levels, we should probably define what world building actually is. World building has many definitions, I'm sure, but we're using a broad umbrella. For us, world building is the process of creating an imaginary world with its own history, culture, geography, and rules to make a story or setting feel immersive. It's essentially the framework your story sits on. And if that framework makes sense, everything inside of it feels grounded. So we're going to go through all 7 levels, break them down, and by the end of this video, you should have a pretty good idea on where you stand as a world builder, and what it would take for you to ascend. As always, this is subjective and based on my own experiences and opinions. And if you're into this kind of stuff, please like the video, subscribe. I make videos like this every week and it genuinely helps, especially on a longer breakdown like this. Also, wishlist our game, Winter Reach Emporium on Steam. The link is in the description below. Let's jump right in to level 1. Level 1 is a map. And for me, this makes sense as the starting point because it's where most world builders begin. You get an idea, you open a blank canvas, and you start drawing land. Now, technically, a map is skippable. If your story is hyperlocal or modern-day grounded, maybe you don't need one. But most fantasy, sci-fi, or speculative settings eventually zoom out. And when they do, your map matters. And here's the thing. There are levels to maps too. You don't have to be a geology expert, and you don't need a degree in climatology. But there are underlying rules. Like the river example from earlier. Once you learn how rivers actually behave, it's impossible to unsee. But it's not just rivers. Why is a city there? Is it near water? Is there trade routes? Is it defensible terrain? Why does that mountain range exist? Does it form a rain shadow? Is it splitting climates? Is that desert there because of geography or just because you needed a desert? Where are your cold regions? Why? What currents affect them? What wind patterns matter? None of these need to be hyper-detailed, but it needs to make sense, or at least have an explanation. And on that note, if your world allows something the Earth wouldn't, that's fine. Floating continents and magical storms are perfect. But if you're breaking real-world logic, you need to understand why you're breaking it. So let's talk about examples. Take Westeros from A Song of Ice and Fire. Just look at the land. The north is huge and cold. It's mostly empty space. That makes sense. Cold regions historically don't support dense populations. The Riverlands are situated between the mountainous Vale and the hilly Westerlands, leaving the Riverlands to be full of converging rivers. This makes sense because rivers flow downhill and merge. Mountain ranges form natural barriers instead of random spikes across the map. The coastline isn't symmetrical or evenly shaped. It feels eroded and irregular. Even the placement of the cities makes sense. Ports are on deep water. Major settlements sit near rivers or crossroads. They're not evenly spaced around like someone dotted them for balance. It feels like it could be a real-world map. Now compare that to something like Kings of the Wild. Again, visually it is appealing, and it does have a strong style. But if you look at it like a physical landscape, things start feeling arranged. Mountain ranges don't seem to follow any tectonic logic. They don't create consistent rain shadows. Rivers split and branch in ways that don't reflect gravity or elevation. You'll see waterways cross land in directions that don't really flow downhill, and sometimes they'll even just disappear completely. The cities and towns overall follow the rivers, but some are scattered randomly through the wilderness, which is fine as long as you explain why they're there. It's not that it's bad art, it's that the physical rules underneath don't really feel grounded or consistent. And then there's Discworld. Discworld breaks the rules, but it works. Discworld doesn't even pretend to follow Earth's geology. It's flat, it's on a turtle. The cosmology is absurd. But the reason it works is because the physical rules are clearly defined from the start. The world behaves according to its own internal system. It's not random. You understand the physical premise, and the map commits to it. That's the core to level 1. The land has to feel like it obeys rules, whether those rules are Earth's or your own. Mountains should form for a reason. Rivers should flow according to elevation. Deserts should exist because something is causing that dryness. Cities should cluster where people could realistically survive, and if they don't, you should know why. You don't need to simulate plate tectonics, but you do need to think about cause and effect. The reason this is level 1 is because if the foundation of your world doesn't make sense, everything built on top of it is starting from unstable ground. Level 2 is where most world builders live, and it's what I call the rule of cool. You've got your map, the land mostly makes sense, and now you can start loading it up with everything you think is cool. You add dragons, obviously. There's a fallen empire nobody fully understands. You have a cursed forest that whispers sweet nothings to your characters. An assassin order operating in the shadows, very edgy. Maybe there's a desert city carved into the bones of a god because you saw someone else do it and you thought that was cool. And at some point you step back and think, this is epic. And it is. This stage is fun and creative. It's where you're just letting yourself build without overthinking everything. You're not worried yet about systemic impact. You're chasing ideas that excite you. You see something in another book or game and think, I want that energy in my world too. The rule of cool is powerful because it grabs attention, creates tone, and gives your world identity all at once. And more often than not, it's normally what makes people interested in your setting in the first place. And a lot of stories fully function at this level. If your characters are strong enough and your narrative is compelling, a cool setting can carry a lot of weight. Not every story needs to simulate political infrastructure or economic systems. Sometimes spectacle, mystery, and strong imagery are enough to make something memorable. So, the problem isn't that rule of cool exists. The problem is when you mistake it for depth. Stacking cool ideas doesn't automatically make something layered. You can keep adding elements. More factions, more gods, more ancient wars, and it starts to feel bigger and bigger. But bigger isn't the same thing as deeper. At level 2, your world is wide and full of ideas. There's always something interesting to point at, but if someone starts asking basic structural questions, you might realize you haven't thought through the implications yet. How does your magic system affect daily life? If this empire fell, what replaced it? What happened to the people who live there? If this artifact is so powerful, why hasn't it destabilized everything? And these questions aren't meant to kill creativity. They're just the kind of questions that reveal whether your world is built on ideas or rules. And again, this isn't a criticism. This is a natural phase. I've probably spent the most time here. It's exciting and it's addictive. It's the part where your world feels like it's expanding every time you open the document. Level 2 is where you figure out what you love to world build. Everything above this level is where you start asking what those things actually mean. Level 3 is surface identity. And level 3 is where your world stops feeling generic. At level 2, you are stacking cool ideas, and at level 3, you start shaping them into things that are truly unique, and maybe even start developing a theme. This is where cohesion comes in. Surface identity is the visual layer of your world. It's the naming conventions, the architecture, the clothing, the symbols, and the way cultures and races differentiate themselves from each other. It's when you draw the line between fantasy stuff and this specific fantasy world. Do people in this region use hard consonants in their name? Does this kingdom favor heavy plate or lighter, more inexpensive armor? Do these people build out of stone or wood? Does this empire use sun imagery everywhere? You're not necessarily building deep institutional logic yet, but you are building a recognizable identity. Surface identity is the beginning of what sets your world apart. It's what lets someone see a helmet silhouette and immediately know where it's from. Now let's look at a few strong examples. Distinct naming conventions in The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is one of the clearest examples of surface identity done well. Tolkien didn't just randomly assign names that sounded fantasy. He built languages first. Elvish was constructed with grammar, sound rules, and internal consistency. You don't have to develop your own language, but any kind of consistency will help. Elvish names share phonetic patterns, and the Rohirrim follow a separate historical inspiration entirely. Place names evolve from those same roots. Because of that consistency, the audience doesn't need labeling to tell them where somebody is from. What that does is subtle, but it's so powerful. It creates cultural separation without having to explain it. I know Gimli and Legolas are from different places from their name alone. This makes the world feel more layered and implies a linguistic history. Even if the viewer never studied the linguistics, they sense that something deeper is underneath the surface. Clothing and armor design in Warhammer 40k. The Imperium didn't just kind of look gothic. It leans all the way in. Cathedrals are everywhere, skulls are on everything. The armor is bulky, over the top, and almost absurd. The important part is that they don't half commit. The same vibe shows up on their weapons, their banners, their buildings. It's very consistent. Then, when you look at another faction, it looks completely different. Whatever it is, it has its own lane and stays in it. You can literally see a silhouette from across the battlefield and know what exactly you're looking at. But one thing to be careful of with surface identity is going too far. The idea called Planet of the Hats is where an entire culture gets boiled down to one defining trait. This is the warrior culture. This is the smart culture. This is the sneaky culture. And then everybody from that place will act the same, dress the same, and think the same. This usually happens when we get excited about a strong aesthetic, and we start reinforcing it so hard there's no room left for variation. Obviously, real societies don't work like that. Even if a region has a strong identity, there's still differences inside of it. There are people who don't fit the mold. Surface identity is supposed to make a culture recognizable. You don't want everybody to be uniform. So when you're building at this level, the goal isn't to reduce society to one trait, it's to give it a consistent outer language, while still letting individuals feel like individuals. Recognizable regional vibes. Avatar: The Last Airbender. Avatar is a really clean example for how strong regional vibes get built. The creators didn't just create 4 nations with 4 colors and 4 elements, and stop there. They anchored each region into real-world cultural inspirations and built outward from that. The Water Tribe draws from Inuit and Arctic cultures, so much so that everything is built from ice and snow. The clothing is fur-lined and settlements cluster in ways that make sense for cold survival. The Earth Kingdom leans into East Asian influence, stone walls and agricultural landscapes as well as deep cities. And the Fire Nation pulls from Imperial Japan and industrial expansion. Red and black dominate. Ships are metal and steam driven, and the architecture feels sharp and imposing. None of this is random. Each region starts with a core inspiration, then commits to it across architecture, clothing, color, environment, and motivation. In Avatar, you don't need a title card to tell you which nation you're in. Your brain picks up on it instantly. That's the power of surface identity. Level 3 isn't about deep structural realism. It's about making sure your world doesn't feel interchangeable. It's making sure that when someone encounters your setting, they can immediately tell where they are. A lot of worlds plateau here, They look incredible. They feel distinct, and they're highly polished. But underneath that polish, the deeper systems might not be integrated yet. And that's where level 4 starts. Level 4, Functional Power. Level 4 is where your world stops just looking distinct and starts behaving logically. Functional power is about what's under the hood. It's about understanding that if something powerful exists in your setting, whether it be magic, technology, or divine influence, it doesn't just sit there as a cool feature. It reshapes the world around it. At this level, you stop asking, is this cool? And you start asking, what does this actually do? If magic is common, what does that do to labor? If dragons exist, how does that affect warfare? If one nation has superior technology, how does the rest of the world respond? Functional power is the point where cause and effect begin shaping the setting. This helps your world because it keeps you from cheating. If power has rules and consequences, you can't just solve problems however you want. You have to work inside the world you built. When something big happens, it won't feel random. It will feel like the result of pressure that has been building. And for the audience, this is where things begin to start clicking. They stop feeling like they're watching events happen because the plot needs them to. They start feeling like the world would react this way, whether the main character existed or not. Now let's look at a few examples. Magic systems in Mistborn. Mistborn is a really good example of functional power through magic. The magic isn't vague, it has rules. You ingest certain metals, you get specific abilities. Those abilities have limits. Some are stronger than others, and some counter those. Because of that, the world builds around it. There's an elite class that controls most of the power. Political authority concentrates around people who can use it. Assassinations and security look much different. Even how people move through cities change because certain powers exist. The magic doesn't just sit there as a cool feature. It creates a completely different hierarchy. And when characters solve problems, they're solving them inside of a system you understand. That's what makes it satisfying. They're not pulling something new out of anywhere. They're working within the rules you already know. Technology level consistency in Dune. Dune is interesting because it intentionally limits technology. They banned advanced thinking machines. That one decision changes everything. Instead of computers doing the heavy lifting, humans are trained to replace them. Entire political and religious systems have formed around that. You also have shields that change how combat works. Guns are no longer the obvious answer. Blades are viable again because of how that technology functions. Nothing feels random. The technology level is constrained, and because it's constrained, the world feels coherent. You can see how that one rule cascades in everything. It doesn't just feel like futuristic stuff was thrown in because it sounded cool. It feels like someone thought through what would actually happen if those rules existed. Political structures in Attack on Titan. Attack on Titan is a really clear example of power reshaping society. Titans exist. They're overwhelmingly strong. So what does that do to humanity? Well, humanity has to build walls. Massive ones. Entire cities structured around defense. The military is central to survival. The political leadership justifies itself based on protection. And technology develops specifically around vertical movement and mobility because that's the only way to fight the Titans. The architecture, the government, and the economy all reflect the threats. It doesn't feel like events are happening in a vacuum. It feels like a world under pressure adjusting to that imbalance. Once you hit level 4, your world starts feeling stable. Power has rules, technology has limits, and magic isn't just aesthetic anymore. That alone is a big jump, but there is something still missing. Up until now, we've mostly been talking about how the world works right now. Level 5 is where you start asking how it got that way. Worlds don't just exist in a static present. That's where we move into deep culture and history. Level 5, Deep Culture and History. Level 5 is where your world stops feeling old and starts being old. Up until this point, you've made it make sense. The map works, the power systems function, culture looks distinct, everything feels intentional. Now, you have to start asking how it got that way. Deep culture isn't just what people wear or what their banners look like. It's what they believe, what they argue about, what they're embarrassed about, what they refuse to let go even though it doesn't make sense anymore. It's traditions that started for practical reasons and then became sacred. It's taboos that nobody questions because they've always been there. And history at this level isn't just, there was a war 500 years ago. It's the ripple effects of that war. It's the borders that still exist because of it. It's the ruins that affect trade. It's a religion that fractured and now has 3 competing branches. And it's stories of how places got their names. Let's give some examples. An example for culture in The Witcher. The Witcher works as a culture example because nothing feels clean or simplified. The prejudice against non-humans isn't just there to create tension. It feels old. You can tell it developed over time through war, economic competition, and fear. Different regions treat elves and dwarves differently, and that difference makes sense based on their local history. Religion isn't unified either. There are dominant faiths, fringe beliefs, cults, and folk superstitions layered on top of each other. Peasants don't think the same way a noble does. Neither do city dwellers or villagers. Even if they're in the same kingdom, beliefs differ. And importantly, people contradict themselves. They hold beliefs that don't fully line up. They act out of emotion instead of logic. That's what deep culture looks like. It's inconsistent in a way that real societies are. History, the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion works because its history is so ingrained in the story. Major events don't just happen and get forgotten. They reshape geography. Entire regions were destroyed, oaths were sworn by generations, and caused wars in the next. Families will carry consequences forward for centuries. By the time you move into The Lord of the Rings, you feel that history is everywhere. The ruins aren't just aesthetic. They belong to fallen kingdoms. Characters reference ancient events as if they still matter. The key thing is continuity. One age flows into the next, and actions compound. So when someone makes a decision in the present, it feels like there's thousands of years riding on that decision. There's a difference between having ancient lore and history that actually shapes the world. Societies that feel ancient, the Elder Scrolls. The Elder Scrolls feels ancient because cultures disagree with themselves. There isn't one unified, clean version of history. There are conflicting interpretations. Different races remember the same events differently. Religious doctrines contradict each other, and political factions reinterpret the past just to justify the present. You see layers of empire on top of empire, ruins from one era reused by another, religious sites repurposed and borders shifting over time. It feels like civilization has been arguing with each other and their own pasts for centuries. In the case of the Elder Scrolls, layered disagreement and an unreliable narrator make it feel old. At level 5, your world has a memory. Things don't just appear because you needed them to, they evolved over time. Once you reach that point, your world stops feeling like a setting and starts feeling like a place that's been lived in for thousands of years. But there's still 2 more levels. Level 6, Infrastructure and Institutions. Level 6 goes deeper than most people will ever need to go, and that's okay. A lot of great stories don't operate here. You don't need to fully understand a simulated tax system to write a compelling novel. You don't need agricultural output tables to run a fun D&D campaign. But if you want a world that truly feels durable, one that can support multiple stories, genres, and timelines, this is where you will eventually end up. This level isn't glamorous. It's not dragons and ancient prophecies. It's banking, trade routes, and military logistics. It's asking, if a city has 200,000 people in it, how are they eating? If an empire spans a continent, how do they actually communicate? How long does it take for an order to travel from the capital to the front line? If level 4 was machinery under the hood, then level 6 is the gears that make up that machinery. And most worlds will only imply this machinery. Level 6 is where you actually think it through. Now let's look at a couple examples. The Iron Bank of Braavos in Game of Thrones. The Iron Bank is one of the best institutional examples in fantasy. It's not flashy, it doesn't breathe fire, it doesn't swing swords. It lends money, but that lending power shapes entire kingdoms. The Iron Throne runs on debt, and wars are financed through loans. When the crown defaults, the bank doesn't throw a tantrum. It backs the opposing claimant. The Iron Bank doesn't need armies, it doesn't need dragons, it controls capital. And because that financial system exists, political decisions feel constrained. Rulers can't just wage wars endlessly without consequence. There's an external force with long-term memory and long-term incentives. It makes the world feel like it operates beyond whoever is sitting on the throne this season. The Vault Network in Fallout. The vaults in Fallout are one of the clearest examples of infrastructure shaping the world long after the original builders are gone. On the surface, they're survival bunkers, underground shelters meant to protect people from nuclear war. But when you start looking closer, they're more than that. They're controlled ecosystems. They have governance structures and social rules. Each vault is designed as a closed system. That means if something fails, everything feels it. If leadership breaks down, the society inside destabilizes. The entire population is at risk. And because they were intentionally designed with specific constraints, sometimes even social experiments, every vault evolves differently over time. When you encounter a vault in the present day, you find the results of decades of isolated infrastructure operating under pressure. The vaults don't exist as cool set pieces. They were engineered systems and shape the people inside of them. The Train and Snowpiercer. Snowpiercer is basically level 6 world building turned into a setting. The entire world is dead outside of the train. So the train isn't just transportation, it's civilization. Everything that is produced happens on board. The class system isn't abstract, it's physically arranged by train cars. The front controls the power and the resources, and the back survives on scraps. If one section fails, the whole thing collapses. What makes it work is that you can trace almost every conflict back to infrastructure. Who controls food, energy, or security? The train has to keep moving. The ecosystem has to remain balanced. That creates limits. That's the infrastructure driving the story. Level 6 is where you built the machinery. It's not flashy, it's not glamorous, but once you've thought through this layer, your world starts feeling alive. Now it can function without a protagonist or a party of players holding it together. And you've advanced on to level 7. Level 7 is a generative world. Level 7 is the goal. This is what most world builders are chasing whether they realize it or not. It's the point where your world is structurally as sound as it can be. The geography makes sense, the cultures feel lived in, powers have rules, and institutions operate independently. You've established everything necessary for the world to function like a real place. And once you reach that point, something interesting happens. The world starts generating stories for you. You can zoom into any city, any province, any port, any period of time, and there's already something there. Tension or slow burning conflict, just waiting to turn into your next story. You don't have to force plot into an empty space anymore. You're uncovering stories that logically exist because of how the world is built. You can follow a king, a merchant, or a criminal. You can even jump back 400 years and tell a completely different story. It all works because the world isn't held together by a single narrative thread anymore. It's self-sustaining. That's level 7. And when you hit level 7, your world isn't just a setting. It's a real world that moves forward even if you stopped writing about it. Alright everyone, so that's the 7 levels. And again, these aren't steps, and you're not failing if you're staying at level 2. A lot of great stories live there. Sometimes the rule of cool is exactly what you need. And the cool part is, this isn't about talent. It's just about awareness. Once you start asking better questions, why is this here, who benefits from this, and what happens if this changes, your world will naturally get stronger. You don't have to build level 7 for every project. Most games or stories don't need it anyway. But if you want to, if you're the kind of person who loves zooming out on a blank map and thinking, okay, if this were real, how would it actually work? Then you know what direction you're heading. So, I'm curious. Where are you at? Are you loading your map with dragons and cursed forests? Or are you knee-deep in trade logistics and institutional corruption at 2 a.m.? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, if it helped you frame your own world a little differently, please like the video and subscribe. If you're into this kind of deep dive stuff, we talk about world building, game design, and all kinds of discussions. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.